The trailer was partially hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown weeds and towering grass, giving the impression that it had been untouched for years. Stepping inside, investigators were met with an unsettling silence. Metal lockers lined both sides of the narrow space, but something was off. While nearly all the lockers were tightly shut, their doors locked or rusted closed, one locker stood slightly ajar. The investigators' focus shifted immediately. With a collective breath held, they began opening lockers one by one, searching for clues, or perhaps bracing for something worse. Eventually, they found Lisa. But tragically, by the time they discovered her, it was already too late. Dear viewers, we appreciate your support and comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you for being with us. Lisa Holm was born on February 7, 1997, in a small and tranquil Swedish town nestled among gentle hills and peaceful forests, the kind of place where everyone knew one another and little ever disturbed the routine pace of daily life. Lisa grew up in this serene setting, surrounded by the love and support of her close-knit family. She lived with her parents and her older sister, and from a young age, she stood out as someone full of energy, optimism, and a deep sense of determination. Even as a child, Lisa had dreams that reached far beyond the borders of her hometown. She was deeply interested in the world around her, its architecture, its history, and its cultures. Long before she graduated high school, Lisa had already made up her mind that she wanted to study architecture. Her heart was set on Australia, a land she had only seen in photographs and documentaries, but one she dreamed of calling home during her university years. It wasn't just a passing fantasy. Lisa was serious. She made plans, set goals, and followed through with quiet conviction. Lisa also had a deep appreciation for travel, a love she shared with her parents. As a family, they had visited numerous countries, exploring new places together. These journeys opened Lisa's eyes to the diversity and beauty of the world and fueled her passion for design and structure. Over time, she developed a spirit of independence. In the summer of 2015, at the age of 18, Lisa got what could be considered her first real job. She was hired at a cozy cafe located about a 40-minute drive from her home. It was a significant step for her, and she took it very seriously. During the initial weeks of her new role, her parents drove her to and from work to ensure her safety and comfort, especially since the job required traveling through rural roads. Recognizing Lisa's commitment and wanting to support her growing independence, her father soon bought her a scooter. Although it was exciting for Lisa, her father remained cautious. For the first several weeks, he drove behind her in his car every weekend morning and evening while she commuted to work. She was still getting used to operating the scooter and navigating traffic on her own. Lisa's work schedule was limited to weekends, which allowed her to balance her job with other responsibilities and social life. It wasn't until Sunday, June 7th, that her father finally allowed her to ride to work alone. That morning felt like a milestone for both of them. Lisa had proven herself responsible, and her father trusted her to make the journey by herself for the very first time. Later that day, around midday, her parents decided to pay her a surprise visit at the cafe. They thought it would be nice to have lunch together and see how she was adjusting to her new role. When they arrived, they found the place buzzing with activity. It was a particularly busy day, and Lisa was working hard, serving customers, clearing tables, and taking orders. Despite the rush, she managed to take a brief break and joined her parents for a quick snack and a warm conversation. Afterward, her parents returned home, feeling proud of the young woman their daughter was becoming. That evening, at exactly 6:23 p.m., Lisa sent her father a text message. She had finished her shift and was leaving the cafe. But just 3 minutes later, something strange happened. Her father received a call from Lisa's phone. When he answered, no one spoke. He could hear vague voices in the background, distant and indistinct, and then the sound of a car door shutting. It was confusing. At first, he assumed Lisa had accidentally dialed him while chatting with colleagues. But something about the silence unsettled him. He called her name a few times, hoping for a response. But there was only silence on the other end. Eventually, he hung up, thinking she would be home soon. However, as the minutes ticked by and there was still no sign of Lisa, A growing sense of unease began to take hold. She was expected to arrive within half an hour, but time passed and she didn't show up. Concern quickly turned into worry. Her father, deeply anxious, tried calling her several more times, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Lisa's phone appeared to be turned off, a troubling sign, especially for someone who was usually so reliable about staying in touch. After waiting a short while longer, her father decided to retrace her route. Perhaps she had encountered trouble on the road, maybe even a mechanical issue with the scooter. Driving slowly, his eyes scanned the roadside for any trace of her, but the familiar route home offered no clues. Eventually, he arrived back at the cafe, holding onto the hope that she was still there. And to his relief, Lisa's scooter was indeed parked in front of the building. But the relief was short-lived. The parking lot was otherwise empty, and the cafe had already closed for the day. Approaching the scooter, he noticed something alarming. The keys were still in the ignition, and Lisa's helmet was left hanging on the handlebars, both highly unusual for someone as careful and responsible as she was. Lisa would never have left her belongings like that unless she planned to return immediately. But she was nowhere to be seen. Lisa's mother, equally worried, called the cafe owner to see if she had any information. The owner was surprised and said she didn't know where Lisa could be. According to her, the cafe had closed just after 6 p.m., and none of the employees had mentioned anything out of the ordinary. Still, moved by the seriousness of the situation, the cafe owner got into her car and headed to the establishment immediately. On her way, she called several of her friends who lived nearby and asked them to join the search. Everyone who heard the story wanted to help. It was unimaginable that something could happen in their peaceful town, especially to someone like Lisa. When the cafe owner arrived, she joined Lisa's father and a few others to begin a thorough search of the building and the surrounding area. They looked inside the cafe, checked the back entrances, and scanned the nearby roads and bushes. Meanwhile, Lisa's mother and older sister drove to the nearest bus stop, hoping that Lisa might have decided for some unknown reason to take public transport home instead of using the scooter. They carefully checked the bus schedules and waited for the next arrival, watching closely as passengers disembarked. But Lisa wasn't there. So her relatives immediately contacted the police. By the time the evening rolled in and the sun dipped below the horizon, it was nearly 7 p.m. When the local police arrived on the scene and assessed the situation, they acted swiftly. The fact that Lisa's scooter was found in the cafe's parking lot, with the keys still inserted in the ignition and her helmet left behind, led them to consider more troubling scenarios. It wasn't just a case of a teenager coming home late. There were genuine concerns that something serious, perhaps even criminal, might have happened. One of the primary possibilities they began to explore was the alarming chance that Lisa may have been taken against her will. Cases of this nature are exceedingly rare in Sweden, particularly in quiet rural communities like the one where Lisa lived. The country is known for its safety and low crime rates, especially outside major urban centers. Because of this, the local authorities did not hesitate to act. Multiple police teams were deployed to canvass the area. Search dogs were brought in, trained to detect human scent and pick up trails even in challenging terrain. Meanwhile, officers knocked on the doors of every home and building near the cafe, hoping someone might have seen or heard something, anything, that could provide a lead. Word of Lisa's disappearance spread rapidly. Friends from her school, former classmates, and members of the community began to post about her on social media. Within hours, her name and photo were being shared across platforms in the hopes that someone might recognize her or have information. The digital campaign was heartfelt and urgent, and people from neighboring towns started offering assistance. It was clear that Lisa's disappearance had touched something deeper in the public. It wasn't just a local issue anymore. Despite the efforts of both the authorities and concerned citizens, the first night passed without any breakthroughs. Volunteers and police combed the surrounding woods, fields, and roads, but no new clues came to light. Her family waited anxiously for any news, clinging to hope through the long and sleepless night. By early Monday morning, the case had grown more serious. The police officially announced Lisa's disappearance to the public through national media channels. They asked anyone who may have seen Lisa that Sunday evening, or noticed anything unusual near the cafe or on the roads leading to it to come forward. Tip lines were opened, and the search entered a new, more intense phase. Around that same time, a local worker who had arrived to start his shift at a barn just across from the cafe made an unexpected discovery. On the floor of the barn, he spotted a single black motorcycle glove. Something about it seemed out of place, and given the active search effort in the area, he immediately reported it to the police. What made this detail even more puzzling was that detectives had already searched that very barn the night before, but they hadn't found the glove then. When the glove was shown to Lisa's parents, they immediately recognized it as hers. This seemingly minor object suddenly became a key piece of evidence. Its presence strongly supported the theory that Lisa may have been taken. The discovery prompted the police to increase their manpower and redirect search efforts toward a wider area around the barn and cafe. As word of Lisa's disappearance spread nationwide, people responded with compassion and urgency. Volunteers began pouring into the area from all across Sweden. Entire families offered to help. Local businesses donated flashlights, bottled water, and food to support the search teams. A prominent Swedish volunteer organization, specializing in searches for missing persons, also stepped in to assist. It was becoming one of the largest coordinated search operations in the country's recent history. On Tuesday, new developments began to emerge, this time from the efforts of civilian volunteers. As they scoured the terrain along a secluded dirt road not far from the cafe, a number of Lisa's personal belongings were discovered. Among them were her phone case, a small printed receipt, a transit ticket, and the shattered glass of a phone screen. Each of these items was later confirmed by her parents to belong to Lisa. Following this trail, searchers continued further along the path and found even more items scattered along the way. Additional fragments of the phone, Lisa's official identification card, and a few more paper receipts. It appeared that these objects had been discarded along the road, potentially from a moving vehicle, as if someone was trying to dispose of evidence or remove identifying items while fleeing the area. This discovery turned the search site into a focal point of the investigation. With this new cluster of evidence, authorities became increasingly confident that Lisa had not simply wandered off. They were now nearly certain that she had been taken and possibly moved through that very route. As such, all available resources, both official and civilian, were concentrated in that area. The mood among the search teams became more urgent, but also more united. People were determined to bring Lisa home. At this point, media outlets across the country were covering the case extensively. Lisa's photo appeared on every major news broadcast. Hashtags calling for her safe return trended on social media. Her story resonated deeply across Sweden, particularly among parents and young people who saw themselves or their loved ones in Lisa's place. Volunteers continued to arrive in growing numbers, with some traveling hours by train and car just to assist in the search. Over 1,000 people ultimately participated in what became one of the largest public search missions in Swedish history. Amidst the growing stream of tips and reports, one particular witness came forward with a story that caught investigators' attention. A local woman who frequently went jogging through the area recounted an unusual encounter. She said that on the day before Lisa vanished, while she was out on her regular run, she noticed a man standing beside a vehicle on a quiet stretch of road. He flagged her down and spoke to her in English, asking for directions to a town she had never heard of. She tried to help him using Google Maps on her phone. However, the man then asked her to get into his vehicle and show him the route using his navigation system. Alarm bells immediately went off in her mind. She politely declined and resumed her run, but the interaction had left her unsettled. What struck her most in hindsight was the impression that she had seen that man before. She believed he was one of the workers who had recently been doing repairs on the very same barn located directly across from the cafe where Lisa worked. That was not the only lead. Lisa's colleagues at the cafe also came forward with important observations. One of the staff members recalled seeing two unfamiliar men loitering across the road from the cafe on the evening of Lisa's disappearance. They seemed to be watching the building, though at the time, the witness didn't think much of it. It was only after learning about Lisa's vanishing that she realized the importance of what she saw and reported the sighting to the police. On Wednesday morning, as the search intensified further, Lisa's father and a few family friends returned to the dirt road where Lisa's scattered belongings had been found. Hoping to find even the smallest clue, they walked farther along the path, checking ditches, bushes, and roadside gravel. Their persistence was rewarded. though the discovery was deeply upsetting. There, among the grass and dirt, they found Lisa's driver's license and the keys to her home. The police and volunteers concentrated all their efforts on this area, but no other items were found. That evening, as the sun sank and dusk took hold, one of the volunteers, a close friend of Lisa's father, was heading home after another long day of searching. On his way, he drove past the cafe and the old barn across from it, the same barn where Lisa's glove had been found days earlier. He noticed something odd. The police tape that had previously sealed off the entrance to the barn was no longer there. The area appeared open once again. Curiosity and concern stirred in him. Though exhausted, he decided to take one more look. He retrieved a flashlight from his car. It was already getting dark, and stepped cautiously into the barn. Dust particles floated in the beam of his light as he walked the uneven floor, scanning each corner and crevice. Minutes passed without incident until something on the ground reflected the beam of his flashlight. A faint sparkle, just barely visible among the dust and debris. As he moved closer, the object came into focus. A small, delicate earring. A second one lay just a short distance away, glinting faintly in the beam of his flashlight. Recognizing the potential significance of the find, the man immediately contacted the authorities. The police responded promptly, taking custody of the earrings and showing them to Lisa's parents. With quiet heartbreak, they confirmed what investigators had feared. The jewelry belonged to their daughter. This find reinforced suspicions that Lisa had been in the barn after leaving the cafe, and that the structure may have played a central role in the sequence of events that led to her disappearance. Following the discovery, police resealed the barn and launched a far more detailed investigation. According to the lead detective, the initial inspection of the site had been limited in scope. On the first day, their focus had been entirely on locating Lisa herself. Smaller details, like tiny personal items, might have been overlooked. This time, a full-scale forensic operation was initiated. Specialists combed through every inch of the building, and search dogs trained in detection were brought in again. What they uncovered added a new layer to the mystery. Behind one of the wooden wall panels, investigators discovered biological material. DNA was present. Though tests would be required for confirmation, the implications were significant. This barn was no longer just a place of interest. It had become a potential scene of criminal activity. As forensic samples were collected and sent for urgent testing, law enforcement extended the search area. On Friday, volunteers made their way to a large farm complex roughly 2 miles from the cafe. The site, consisting of several industrial-sized barns and sheds, was frequented by workers and often bustled with seasonal laborers. Upon arrival, the search party began inspecting the ground systematically. But before they could cover much ground, 2 unfamiliar men appeared. They seemed uneasy and approached the team cautiously. They spoke only in English and told the volunteers that the police had already searched the farm, implying that further efforts would be unnecessary. This raised some suspicion. The search coordinator, an experienced volunteer leader, found the men's tone oddly firm and their presence unexpected. He decided to press on with the inspection, choosing not to take their word at face value. The 2 men lingered for a while, walking around the property and watching the volunteers closely. After some time, they returned to their vehicle and left the area without further comment. Their brief visit and unusual behavior didn't go unnoticed, especially considering that they were complete strangers in a small rural area where unfamiliar faces stood out. Roughly an hour after the men departed, a breakthrough occurred. Behind one of the livestock sheds, buried under what appeared to be a hastily arranged pile of branches, volunteers discovered a group of personal items: a motorcycle helmet, a jacket, and a set of headphones. All of them were quickly identified as belonging to Lisa Holm. The police were notified immediately, and officers arrived on site within minutes. The area was sealed off, and forensic experts were summoned once again to examine the surroundings. This farm, like the barn, was now considered an important location in the investigation. Meanwhile, detectives began piecing together the growing body of clues and accounts. They recalled the earlier testimony from the jogger who had been approached by a man speaking English. Her description had matched the general profile of one of the men seen around the cafe and barn. That man had asked her to enter his car, a request she wisely declined. Her instinctive discomfort was now viewed as extremely relevant. Investigators also remembered a detail from earlier in the case. During the initial stages of the search, police had spoken to residents of homes near the cafe and barn. One house stood out. It was occupied by two brothers originally from Lithuania, along with the wife of one of them. All three individuals communicated only in English. In fact, they were the only people in the surrounding area who didn't speak Swedish. The detectives had already taken note of this unusual circumstance. But now, further connections began to emerge. The two brothers were employed at both the barn where Lisa's glove and earrings had been found, and at the farm where her helmet and jacket were just recovered. The dirt path where Lisa's belongings had been scattered also led directly toward their residence. These factors, combined with their location, work history, language, and proximity, made them highly relevant to the investigation. The detectives had no definitive evidence yet, but the circumstantial case against them was growing stronger. Given the circumstances, the authorities made the decision to bring all three individuals in for formal questioning. While investigators prepared for interviews, volunteers and forensic teams continued their work at the farm. One part of the property began drawing attention, a rusted trailer hidden behind a storage shed. The trailer was partially concealed by overgrown weeds and tall grass, giving it the appearance of long disuse. However, closer inspection revealed otherwise. Next to the trailer's door, the grass was flattened. It looked as if someone had recently been lying there or walking in and out. Some blades of grass were visibly caught under the trailer door itself, signs that the door had been opened and closed recently. This contradicted the assumption that the trailer had been abandoned. Inside, the scene was eerie. The trailer appeared to have once served as a makeshift changing room for workers. Rows of metal lockers lined the interior walls, coated in a fine layer of dust and cobwebs. But there was one strange detail. While almost all of the lockers were locked shut, one stood ajar. Investigators immediately focused their attention on this locker, fearing what they might find inside. They started opening every cabinet and eventually found Lisa in one of them. News of the discovery spread rapidly throughout Sweden, rippling through communities like a wave of sorrow and disbelief. The story had already gripped the nation, dominating front pages and headlines for days. But the confirmation of Lisa's fate sent a collective chill through the public consciousness. In a country where such cases were exceedingly rare, the loss of a young woman under such circumstances struck a deeply emotional chord. People were shocked, not only by the tragedy itself, but by the fact that it could unfold in their own peaceful rural communities. As journalists scrambled to report the update, a peculiar and unsettling detail began to surface online. A group of internet users noticed an obscure YouTube channel that had posted a video nearly 2 weeks earlier, before Lisa was reported missing. The video was simply titled 13, and it featured a cryptic countdown. But the most disturbing part was the channel's name. It had been changed to Lisa Holm. The combination of timing and name created a stir, quickly attracting media attention and fueling online speculation. For a brief moment, theories spread like wildfire. Was this a warning? Could someone have predicted what would happen? Was it a form of taunting? But it didn't take long for digital investigators and law enforcement to uncover the truth. The video had originally been uploaded with a different title and under another channel name. After Lisa's case gained nationwide attention, someone changed the account name and video title to gain attention, or perhaps to provoke fear or confusion. It was a deeply insensitive prank or an attempt to create a viral conspiracy. Authorities ultimately dismissed the video as unrelated but cautioned against the spread of such content, which only deepened public distress. While the public processed the devastating discovery, behind the scenes, the investigation was intensifying. Authorities were determined to identify and apprehend the person responsible, now with even greater urgency. At the time Lisa was found, police had already brought in 3 individuals for questioning, 2 brothers and the wife of one of them. They were foreign nationals, originally from Lithuania, and they had all been living in a house near the cafe and barn, both of which were critical locations in the case. The 3 individuals denied any involvement. Each claimed to have been home on the evening Lisa disappeared. According to their statements, the older brother, known as Narus, had been asleep in his room. His wife was reportedly in the kitchen preparing dinner, while the younger brother was using the computer. Narus later added that around 8 p.m., he had briefly left home to visit a nearby gas station where he claimed to have purchased pizza and cigarettes. Investigators, however, remained skeptical. All three alibis depended entirely on one another, and no independent witness could confirm their whereabouts. Given the circumstances and their proximity to the locations involved in Lisa's disappearance, police had strong reasons to doubt their version of events. Nevertheless, DNA samples were collected from all three. At that point, though, investigators still lacked any concrete evidence directly linking any of them to Lisa or the scene. That changed soon. Forensic experts were meticulously analyzing the barn across from the cafe, the same location where Lisa's glove and earrings had been discovered. Inside a small office room that overlooked the road and the cafe itself, specialists made a significant breakthrough. They located biological material, which was immediately collected and sent to a laboratory for DNA analysis. Within days, results confirmed a match. The DNA belonged to 35-year-old Narus, the older of the two brothers. This development dramatically shifted the course of the investigation. Moreover, in another section of the barn, investigators found additional traces of DNA, this time on a length of rope located beneath a pipe on the floor of an adjacent room. Laboratory analysis identified two distinct DNA profiles, one belonging to Lisa, the other once again to Narus. The discoveries didn't stop there. Lisa's jacket, recovered earlier during the search at the farm, was re-examined. Investigators identified more biological material embedded in the fabric. Once again, it matched Narus. And finally, a hair belonging to Lisa was also recovered from the floor of the barn room, an area Narus had direct access to through his work. This combination of findings marked a pivotal moment in the case. For the first time, there was irrefutable forensic evidence linking one suspect, Narus, to both Lisa and the location central to her disappearance. While he continued to deny any wrongdoing, the DNA findings painted a very different picture. Despite these revelations, there was nothing directly tying the younger brother or the wife to any part of the crime. With no physical evidence or independent witness testimony implicating them, authorities were compelled to release both. Almost immediately after their release, the couple left Sweden and returned to their home country. The trial preparations were extensive. Defense attorneys tried to argue that Narus's DNA might have been found at the barn and farm for innocent reasons. After all, he had worked there for some time, and some trace material could have remained from regular use. His legal team emphasized that his presence in those locations did not, by itself, prove wrongdoing. The challenge for the prosecution, then, was to prove that this DNA was not simply incidental, but that it indicated direct involvement in Lisa's disappearance during the critical time frame. Key to their case was the forensic evidence discovered not just in workspaces, but on Lisa's clothing and personal belongings, items she had on her the day she went missing. One of the most compelling pieces of additional evidence came from witness testimony. A member of the local community told police that they had seen a vehicle matching Narus's car traveling along the road between the cafe and the farm multiple times around the time Lisa went missing. This directly contradicted his claim of being asleep at home. As the investigation pressed forward, the entire nation remained riveted by the developments in the case. Lisa Holm's name continued to dominate headlines, and public interest in the outcome did not wane. The police, aware of how closely this case was being followed, redoubled their efforts. With this in mind, the investigation extended beyond Sweden's borders. A team of Swedish investigators traveled to Lithuania to re-interview Narus's wife and his younger brother, who had both returned to their home country shortly after being released. Now, months later, with new evidence and growing public pressure, detectives hoped for a different outcome. When they spoke to Narus's wife, her story remained the same. She insisted, once again, that her husband had stayed home between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. that evening, and that she had been preparing dinner while he rested. However, when investigators sat down with the younger brother, the conversation took a surprising and crucial turn. After a few moments of silence, he confessed. He told investigators that Narus had not, in fact, been home the entire evening. Instead, he admitted that his older brother had left the house and didn't return until around 7:30 p.m. When he came back, he looked disheveled, his clothing dirty and dusty. 4 months later, the trial began. It was one of the most closely watched court proceedings in Sweden in recent memory. Naruse maintained his innocence. Over the course of a month, the court reviewed a vast array of evidence: DNA reports, digital records, behavioral analyses, and witness statements. The combination of physical evidence and inconsistent testimony eventually led the court to a unanimous conclusion. Naruse was found guilty. The sentence was life imprisonment, to be served in a high-security correctional facility in Sweden. In early 2017, Naruse submitted a formal request to be transferred to a prison in Lithuania. The reasons behind this request were not immediately clear, especially considering that prisons in Lithuania are widely known to have far less favorable conditions than those in Sweden. Nevertheless, Swedish authorities approved the request. The decision, in part, reflected economic considerations. Housing an inmate in Sweden comes at a significant daily cost to taxpayers. It wasn't until later that same year that Naruse's true motive came to light. After his transfer, he appealed to a Lithuanian court for a sentence review. His legal team argued for a reduction, and surprisingly, the court initially granted it. His life sentence was shortened to 15 years. For a moment, it appeared that Naruse might succeed in dramatically reducing the consequences of his conviction. But public outrage in Lithuania quickly followed. Appeals were filed, and within a matter of weeks, the Lithuanian court reversed its earlier ruling. The original life sentence was reinstated. Naruse would now serve his full term, without the comfort and privileges he had once received in the Swedish prison system. 5 years passed quietly. Then, in August of 2022, an incident occurred that brought his name back into the headlines. During a routine transfer of inmates within the Lithuanian facility, an altercation broke out between prisoners. Though staff responded quickly and emergency services were called, the injuries he sustained proved to be severe. Naruse passed away on the way to the hospital. Armed with a warrant, law enforcement officers entered the residence of Gloria Garry, fully prepared to conduct a thorough and meticulous investigation. At first glance, the house appeared neat and well kept. However, as the officers began to explore further, opening doors, venturing down hallways, and eventually descending into the basement, officers were forced to move carefully and deliberately through the cramped spaces, clearing pathways as they went. Blankets were lifted, boxes were moved, and sealed containers were opened, all in the hopes of uncovering something that could advance their investigation. Amid the disorganized chaos, the officers stumbled upon a deeply unsettling discovery. Forensic teams were brought in to confirm the identity, and soon after, their worst fears were confirmed. It was indeed Gloria Garry. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Gloria Garry was born on November 6, 1967, in the heart of Des Moines, Iowa. She was the first child of Thomas and Mary Ann Garry, a middle-class couple known for their strong work ethic and commitment to community. From an early age, Gloria stood out, not with volume or flamboyance, but with quiet determination and an intellect that demanded notice without ever seeking it. She wasn't just bright. She was laser-focused, meticulous, and had a natural affinity for logic and numbers. It came as no surprise to anyone who knew her that she would go on to pursue a career in technology, where those traits could shine. As she grew older, Gloria pursued a degree in computer science at a state university, graduating with honors. She eventually landed a position at Urban Daily, a growing tech and media company, where she specialized in systems analysis and cybersecurity. Her coworkers often said she was the kind of person who brought order to chaos. She wasn't flashy or loud, but you knew things were in capable hands when Gloria was involved. She never missed a deadline, double-checked every line of code, and if she ever took a shortcut, no one could find it. By the age of 49, Gloria remained single, not out of bitterness or regret, but because she had made peace with the life she had chosen. She had a deep reservoir of affection for her extended family, often spending weekends with her aging parents, assisting them with groceries, medications, or simply sharing a meal and catching up on the week. Though she never had children of her own, she was a beloved aunt who remembered every birthday, graduation, and school play. Her nieces and nephews looked up to her not just as family, but as someone who showed that steadiness and kindness could be a life philosophy. Gloria lived by herself in a modest one-story home on the quieter south side of Des Moines. Her house was a reflection of her personality, orderly, clean, and tastefully decorated with soft colors and antique accents. In the warmer months, neighbors would often spot her outside tending to her flowers, especially her prized tulips and irises. She would usually have her elderly terrier Max slowly waddling behind her. Though she lived alone, she was never perceived as lonely. People on her block spoke of her as dependable, gracious, and quietly generous. When someone lost a loved one, Gloria was always there, casserole in hand, ready to listen more than she spoke. Books were Gloria's great escape. She adored detective stories and psychological thrillers, particularly those with intricate plots and strong female protagonists. Her shelves were lined with the works of Agatha Christie, Ruth Rendell, and Tana French. Another of her hobbies was maintaining her small but fascinating collection of antique clocks, each one cleaned, wound, and set with painstaking care. She had little interest in travel or nightlife. Instead, she found joy in the familiar rhythm of her days. Gloria's world was not small out of fear, but because she believed in depth over breadth. But the peaceful rhythm of her life would be disrupted in the most unsettling way. On Tuesday, January 3rd, everything appeared to be normal. Gloria finished her workday at Urban Daily, where she reportedly left just after 5:30 p.m. She picked up dinner from a local pizzeria, something she often did on Tuesdays, and headed home. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. When she failed to show up at work the next morning, her co-workers were surprised. Gloria wasn't just punctual. She was usually early. At first, her absence was brushed off as a possible flu or a rare case of oversleeping. But as the hours passed and she remained unreachable, a faint current of worry began to stir. By January 4, concern had grown. Gloria had plans to meet family for dinner that evening, and when she didn't show up or call, her brother tried reaching her by phone, multiple times. All calls went to voicemail. That was entirely out of character. She had never missed a family event without notifying someone in advance. By the next morning, with still no contact and another missed day of work, her family and co-workers decided it was time to act. A missing persons report was filed with local authorities on January 5th. Officers conducted a welfare check at Gloria's residence, but found no sign of forced entry or disturbance. Her front door was locked. The pizza box from the night she vanished was in the trash. Her car, a red Honda Civic, a vehicle her friends joked could be spotted from a mile away, was gone. Nothing appeared stolen or tampered with. Yet the woman who lived her life with unwavering consistency had vanished without a word, without a trace, and without a clue. Neighbors expressed disbelief. She was the kind of person who followed the rules, who stuck to the plan, one neighbor said. If something happened to Gloria, it had to be serious. Her home showed no sign of hurried departure or distress. Her dog, Max, had been left in the care of a neighbor, but Gloria hadn't mentioned any travel plans. As days passed, her absence transformed from puzzling to deeply disturbing. Her family mobilized immediately. They coordinated social media outreach, created digital flyers, and contacted news outlets for coverage. A Facebook page was launched to gather tips and keep the public informed. Volunteers helped distribute flyers in both Des Moines and surrounding counties. Some even joined in organized searches. A tip line was created for people who preferred anonymity. While the family held out hope, they braced for all possibilities. That faint, fragile glimmer of hope flickered back to life on the afternoon of January 12th, more than a full week after the baffling disappearance of Gloria Garry. What seemed at first like just another dead end transformed into a potentially pivotal development. Around midday, authorities in the quiet, remote town of Pound, Utah, a place largely unknown beyond its sparse population and tranquil scenery, reported the sighting of a red Honda Civic parked near a modest convenience store on the edge of town. It wasn't just any red Civic. The Iowa license plates matched those registered to the vehicle Gloria had last been seen driving before she vanished without a trace. The officers on duty acted swiftly. They approached the car with caution, curious and hopeful that perhaps Gloria herself might be inside or nearby. But by the time they checked the registration and returned to the vehicle, it had disappeared. vanished as mysteriously as Gloria had. Store surveillance footage provided the only clue. A grainy, time-stamped video showing a man climbing into the driver's seat of the car and pulling away. The image quality was poor, distorted by glare and low resolution, but officers noted a few significant details. The man appeared to be wearing dark gloves, or possibly had a dark tattoo running along one of his forearms. His face, unfortunately, was turned away from the camera, and the blurry nature of the footage left much to interpretation. Even so, for investigators and the Garry family, it was something. A spark. A thin but tangible thread to pull on in a case that, until that point, had seemed entirely stalled. From there, the investigation intensified. Local authorities collaborated with their counterparts in Des Moines, where Gloria had been reported missing, to gather surveillance recordings from nearby intersections, gas stations, and local businesses. They scoured hours of footage, hoping to catch another glimpse of the red Civic or the unidentified driver. Who was this man? How had he gotten possession of Gloria's vehicle? Was she with him, or was the car abandoned and later stolen by someone else? And more pressingly than anything else, where was Gloria now? Despite the unanswered questions, one conclusion became increasingly undeniable to everyone involved. Gloria Garry had not simply chosen to disappear. Whatever had happened, it was clear that she had not left of her own free will. When Gloria's family was shown the images extracted from the blurry surveillance tape, they were visibly shaken. Sitting around a kitchen table in Des Moines, they studied the low-resolution frames in silence. The man behind the wheel was a stranger. No familiar features, no hint of recognition, no connection that made any sense. None of the family members had any known ties to Utah, much less to the remote town of Pound, which seemed an improbable place for her car to surface. The location itself only added to the mystery. Why Pound? It was a place few people passed through without purpose. The town wasn't situated on any major routes, and its only claim to fame was a small hiking trail and a family-owned diner that hadn't changed since the 1980s. The appearance of the car there made no logical sense. Unless, of course, someone had intentionally taken it somewhere unlikely, somewhere off-grid, hoping to buy time or avoid attention. With pressure mounting and questions swirling, Des Moines investigators coordinated with Utah authorities to push the still images to the public. Social media channels lit up with the grainy photo of the unknown man. Local and regional news stations broadcast the story. Community boards were updated with digital flyers. Alongside the image, a request. If you recognize this individual or have any information about the whereabouts of Gloria Garry or her red 2003 Honda Civic, please come forward. Tips can be submitted anonymously. Time was not on their side. Every hour felt heavier than the last. Each lead that went nowhere seemed to press harder on the hearts of Gloria's loved ones, and investigators knew the longer the case stretched on, the colder it could become. Then, remarkably, less than 24 hours after the public appeal, a call came in that would jolt the case forward once more. It was the morning of January 13, and a motorist traveling a rural, unpaved stretch of road just outside Pound noticed something peculiar. A red vehicle partially hidden behind a stand of pine trees. The paint looked faded, but what stood out more was the way it was parked, angled, off the shoulder, and barely visible from the main road. The driver felt uneasy. Something wasn't right. They pulled over just long enough to snap a quick photo and call it in as a suspicious vehicle. A nearby patrol unit responded quickly. When the officer arrived on scene, he immediately saw the car tucked beneath low-hanging branches. As he approached, more unusual details emerged. The windows were fogged, suggesting the car had been occupied recently, despite the cold morning air. The once bright red paint had been partially spray-painted with uneven strokes of black, an obvious but rushed effort to alter the vehicle's appearance. It hadn't been done well. In places, the red paint still showed through, and there were visible handprints left in the drying black paint. Even more troubling, the passenger side window had been shattered and then patched over using layers of duct tape and a makeshift plastic covering. This wasn't a quick roadside repair. It was improvised concealment. The vehicle had clearly been tampered with, possibly to delay identification or avoid detection. The officer remained cautious as he radioed in the plate. When dispatch confirmed it belonged to Gloria Garry's missing vehicle, his demeanor shifted. He stepped back, called for backup, and began a slow, deliberate approach toward the driver's side. As he neared the driver's side, the door creaked open. A man, estimated to be in his early 20s, stepped out holding a red plastic gas can. He wore a hooded sweatshirt and jeans, his face neutral but clearly alert. When questioned, the man casually explained that he had run out of gas and had pulled over to rest until someone could bring him fuel. He seemed relaxed at first, but the officer's trained eye picked up several concerning details. The man's hands were streaked with what looked like black spray paint, matching the fresh patches on the car. The officer inquired about the broken window, and the man offered a vague and inconsistent explanation, suggesting it had been an accident during a moment of frustration. His story didn't quite add up, and the inconsistencies only heightened the officer's suspicion. Calmly but firmly, the officer asked the man to step away from the car for a routine check. No weapons or dangerous items were found on the man during the search, but the officer decided it was best to transport him to the local station for further questioning. At the same time, dispatch confirmed that the red Honda Civic was indeed registered to Gloria Garry, the missing woman from Iowa. This revelation immediately shifted the situation from routine to urgent. When questioned at the station, the young man identified himself as Kyle Jeepson, a 26-year-old originally from eastern Iowa. When asked who owned the car, Jeepson claimed it belonged to his aunt. However, when pressed for the woman's full name, he hesitated and failed to provide an answer. Realizing he had been caught in a lie, he quickly changed course and admitted that he had taken the car without permission. He claimed to have found it in a driveway and decided to borrow it, figuring no one would notice right away. Utah authorities swiftly obtained a warrant to search the car. What they discovered inside painted a troubling picture. The back seat and trunk were packed with personal items, not belonging to Gloria, but to a man preparing for extended time on the move. Inside, officers found a tent, multiple sets of men's clothing, a few toothbrushes, a stack of energy bars, rolls of duct tape, a canister of black spray paint, and various camping supplies. Everything indicated that Kyle had been preparing to either live off the grid or avoid detection for as long as possible. Back at the station, Jeepson's behavior grew increasingly erratic. At first, he agreed to speak without legal representation, insisting that he had nothing to hide. But as questions continued, his calm demeanor began to crack. He became visibly anxious, fidgeting in his seat, struggling to maintain eye contact. Detectives later noted that his hands trembled slightly when he was asked about Gloria Garry. A background check soon revealed that Jeepson had an outstanding warrant in Iowa for a previous burglary, a non-violent offense, but still enough to warrant concern. While it initially seemed that Kyle's story might just be one of petty theft and flight from a criminal record, his response to questions about Gloria took the investigation in a much darker direction. When asked directly if he knew where Gloria was, Kyle initially nodded. He said, "She's still in her house." But then he paused, seemed to second-guess himself, and refused to say more. Detectives pressed him to clarify. After a long silence, Kyle finally muttered that Gloria wasn't alive anymore, and that she was still there, in the house. He wouldn't provide further details at that moment, but the implication was clear. Investigators in Utah, realizing the gravity of what had just been said, immediately relayed the information to their counterparts in Iowa. Authorities in Des Moines wasted no time. Armed with this new information, they obtained a warrant and entered Gloria's residence. What they would find in that home would ultimately confirm Jeepson's cryptic confession. But those details were not immediately shared with the public, out of respect for the family and the ongoing investigation. In subsequent interviews, Jeepson explained, somewhat erratically, that he had not originally intended to harm anyone. On the night of January 3rd, he claimed he had been aimlessly wandering around a neighborhood in Des Moines. Cold, hungry, and desperate, he stumbled upon what he thought was an unoccupied house. Seeing the lights off and no car in the driveway, he allegedly broke in through a side window and hid inside. According to his statement, Kyle waited in the shadows as Gloria returned home later that evening carrying a pizza box. What happened next was described by Jeepson in a strange, disconnected tone. He told detectives that in those moments, it felt like he was watching himself from a distance, as though he wasn't fully in control of what was happening. He described the experience as watching a movie where you're in it, but you can't stop anything. Investigators listened carefully, noting the blend of evasion, distortion, and passive language. While he offered a partial account, many questions remained unanswered. What exactly happened that night? Was this premeditated? Or did Jeepson's story about a chance encounter conceal something more deliberate? Kyle Jeepson claimed that everything about the days following the incident felt strangely disconnected from reality. When investigators later questioned him about his state of mind, he responded in vague, abstract terms, saying it felt like everything was happening through a screen and that he didn't fully feel present. According to his own words, he experienced no remorse, not because he lacked understanding, but because it all seemed surreal, like watching someone else's story unfold. Instead of fleeing immediately after the event, Kyle did something that left investigators deeply unsettled. He remained in Gloria Garry's home. For a number of days, he stayed there as though nothing had changed. He reportedly took long showers, browsed channels on the television, and even logged onto social media. Detectives later uncovered that he had used Gloria's Wi-Fi connection to send a few messages and post photos to Snapchat. The nature of those images remains undisclosed, but at least 2 of his contacts later told authorities that the messages seemed off, raising red flags that something wasn't quite right. Despite their unease, no one contacted police at the time. Kyle, meanwhile, helped himself to $200 in cash he found tucked away in a drawer and eventually decided to leave town. He took Gloria's red Honda Civic, a vehicle that would later become key to his capture, and drove across several state lines, making brief stops at rest areas in small towns, sleeping in the car or in remote campsites. It appeared to investigators that, even while on the run, Kyle didn't fully acknowledge the magnitude of what he had done. His behavior painted a portrait of someone either dangerously disconnected from reality or pretending to be. Following his arrest in Utah, Kyle Jeepson was placed in a regional detention center while awaiting extradition to Iowa. Law enforcement officials began the slow, meticulous process of building their case. But one haunting question loomed over everything. If Gloria Garry had truly passed away, as Kyle claimed, where was she? Her family, who had first reported her missing, had visited her home multiple times in those early days. They had walked through the front rooms, checked the kitchen, glanced into the hallway and living room, but they hadn't found anything to suggest foul play. Even after the police joined the investigation, early walkthroughs of the property had yielded no signs of a crime. However, those searches had been limited. Without a proper search warrant, officers were legally restricted from opening locked doors or rummaging through storage areas like the attic, basement, or tightly packed closets. They could only observe what was visible on the surface. When Kyle told investigators that Gloria was still in the house, many were stunned. How could so many people, including her family and trained officers, have missed something so critical? Why hadn't they seen any trace of what had occurred? The statement from Kyle prompted authorities to act swiftly. A full search warrant was requested and granted without delay, giving detectives the authority to perform a complete examination of the home, including every nook and cranny. By this time, 9 days had passed since Gloria Garry's sudden disappearance. Her loved ones had grown increasingly desperate, caught between fading hope and rising dread. With warrant in hand, law enforcement officers re-entered Gloria's home, prepared for a thorough investigation. Inside, they faced an unexpected obstacle. It became clear that Gloria had quietly struggled with a condition many had overlooked: hoarding disorder. While her home appeared orderly on the surface, behind closed doors and down in the basement, items had accumulated over the years. Boxes stacked to the ceiling, newspapers and magazines dating back decades, and various belongings stored without clear organization. The clutter made the search labor-intensive. Officers moved methodically, clearing paths through narrow walkways of stored items, shining flashlights into dim corners, lifting blankets, and opening sealed containers. The scene was overwhelming, but they pressed on. Eventually, among the disarray, officers made a grim discovery. Forensic teams were brought in to confirm the identity, and soon after, their worst fears were confirmed. It was indeed Gloria Garry. Out of respect for the family and to protect the dignity of the deceased, The exact location within the home was not made public. Police emphasized that the condition of the home, combined with legal limitations in earlier visits, had contributed to the delay in finding her. But the public, understandably, was shaken. The idea that someone could remain in their own home, unnoticed for days, was deeply unsettling. Residents of Des Moines were left in a state of collective disbelief. The peaceful community where Gloria lived had always been viewed as safe, a place where neighbors watched out for one another and trouble rarely made headlines. Now that illusion had been shattered. Further investigation into Kyle Jeepson's past revealed that this incident wasn't his first encounter with the law, nor his first intrusion into someone's home. Just 5 days before Gloria was reported missing, on the evening of December 29, 2016, Kyle had broken into another home, this time belonging to a woman named Icy Taylor. Ms. Taylor lived alone on Hullum Avenue, not far from Gloria's neighborhood. She had returned home from work at around 8:30 p.m. and walked into her kitchen, only to find Kyle there. He had helped himself to food from her refrigerator and a glass of wine from her counter. Though terrified, Ms. Taylor kept her composure. She raised her voice, demanded that the intruder leave immediately, and surprisingly, Kyle complied. He dropped what he was holding and bolted from the home without confrontation. Shaken but unharmed, Taylor rushed to her window and caught a glimpse of the retreating figure. She quickly realized she recognized him. He was the son of her former neighbor. She wasted no time contacting the police to report the incident. While nothing had been stolen, Taylor emphasized how disturbing and unpredictable the encounter had been. Her concerns were taken seriously, and a warrant was issued for Jeepson's arrest. However, by the time officers arrived to follow up, he had already disappeared. For Taylor and her family, the incident was a wake-up call. She had previously felt safe in her home, but that confidence was gone. Not long after, she made the difficult decision to move out of Des Moines entirely, saying she no longer felt secure in the community she had once loved. When she later learned of Gloria Garry's fate, she realized with chilling clarity just how serious the threat had been. Her own experience had been a close call, closer than she'd ever imagined. Kyle Jeepson was eventually charged with first-degree murder, in addition to burglary and vehicle theft. Given the severity of the charges and his history of evading law enforcement, the judge set his bail at $1 million in cash, a figure meant to reflect the seriousness of the case and the risk he posed to the public. But the story did not come to a close with the arrest, nor even with the verdict. In truth, it evolved into a deeply layered tragedy, one that rippled across two families and shook an entire community. On one side stood the family of Gloria Garry, people mourning the loss of a beloved daughter, sister, and aunt, whose quiet life had ended in a way no one could have imagined. On the other side stood the parents of Kyle Jeepson, struggling to come to terms with the realization that their own son was behind a crime that had horrified the town. For them, it was a reality too jarring to reconcile. When the news of Kyle's actions reached his parents, they were devastated. They were described as decent, hard-working people who had tried their best to raise their son with structure and values. His father withdrew from public life entirely. Friends of the family said the couple had noticed some changes in Kyle's behavior over the past year, but nothing that could have predicted what would ultimately unfold. As investigators dug into Kyle's past, more details emerged. Kyle had been working at a local pub just 10 minutes from Gloria's house. For a time, he had a reputation as a dependable employee. He showed up early, covered shifts for others, and made light conversation with customers. Coworkers described him as a bit reserved, but always respectful and seemingly kind. However, after he was let go from the pub, reasons not publicly detailed, something seemed to shift. Those close to him noted that he became withdrawn, harder to reach, and more unpredictable. He stopped returning messages. Some friends assumed he had simply taken a job elsewhere, while others assumed he had moved out of town. No one, not even his own family, suspected that Kyle had retreated into something far darker than isolation. One moment, in retrospect, stood out as particularly eerie. After Gloria went missing, her family and friends worked tirelessly to spread awareness. They handed out flyers with her photo at grocery stores, schools, and local businesses. One of the stops they made was the very pub where Kyle had once worked. Without hesitation, a staff member taped Gloria's missing persons flyer to a prominent spot in the front window. At the time, it was simply one more act of solidarity. Later, that very act became a haunting reminder. The man responsible had once worked behind that counter. The same window that held Gloria's image had once reflected the face of the one who took her life. When Kyle's identity as the suspect was revealed, the staff at the pub were stunned. Former co-workers expressed disbelief. "He was just this quiet guy," one of them said. "The idea that someone like that was capable of this, it just doesn't make sense." The shock extended beyond those who knew Kyle. The entire city of Des Moines and surrounding communities watched in disbelief as the details of the case unfolded. Legal proceedings began quietly but built in intensity as more facts came to light. The courtroom filled with a mixture of media, family members, and residents following the case. The trial concluded in September 2017, bringing a measure of legal closure to a case that had unsettled so many. Kyle Jeepson, at the time just 22 years old, ultimately agreed to a plea deal in order to avoid the possibility of a harsher sentence at trial. His legal team attempted to argue for leniency, pointing to his mental state and suggesting that his actions stemmed from an internal crisis that had gone unchecked. They referenced his previous break-in at I.C. Taylor's home as evidence of a downward spiral. However, the court remained resolute. The memory of Gloria Garry, by all accounts a kind, respectful, and generous woman, loomed over every moment of the trial. Her family spoke of her love for books, her quiet routines, and the countless lives she had touched. Her elderly father, unable to bear the weight of the trial, declined to attend the proceedings. He told reporters he could not sit in the same room as the man responsible for ending his daughter's life. "It would destroy me," he said in a quiet interview outside his home. "I want to remember her for who she was." For his part, Jeepson attempted to explain himself. He described a feeling of emotional collapse in the weeks leading up to the crime. He claimed that he had been overwhelmed by what he referred to as internal demons, a phrase he repeated several times during sentencing. He expressed regret, but his words were met with silence from the courtroom. Even his tears during his final statement were met with skepticism. The judge, who had reviewed the results of a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, pointed out that Jeepson had been found fully competent to stand trial. There was no diagnosis of any mental illness or condition that would absolve him of full responsibility. In the end, the judge handed down a stern and unequivocal sentence. Kyle Jeepson received 50 years in prison for his actions against Gloria Garry. An additional 10 years were added for the earlier burglary at the home of I.C. Taylor. The court mandated that these sentences be served consecutively, meaning Kyle Jeepson would need to serve at least 35 years before he would be eligible to request parole. For many in the public, the sentence brought a sense of justice. But for others, lingering questions remained, especially one that continued to puzzle investigators, journalists, and residents alike. How could Gloria have remained undiscovered in her own home for 9 full days, even after multiple searches? While police declined to release all details, citing the family's right to privacy, some insight came from interviews conducted with Gloria's relatives in the weeks following the trial. It was revealed that Gloria had quietly battled hoarding tendencies in recent years. Her small home, filled wall to wall with books, papers, unopened packages, and storage bins, had become increasingly difficult to navigate. Her love of mystery novels had turned into a growing obsession. She collected them faster than she could read them, stacking them on counters, staircases, even on the floor. The home, in effect, became a labyrinth. During the early days of her disappearance, family members had entered to check on her, but only in the main rooms, never realizing that critical areas might be obscured. They had assumed, wrongly, that if she were there, they would have seen signs. But in a house full of carefully balanced stacks and hidden corners, the truth remained out of view. In the end, Gloria Garry's story became more than just a case file or a headline. It served as a reminder of how the quietest lives can leave the deepest echoes. Her kindness, her care for family, and her simple love of stories had shaped the people around her. She hadn't wanted much from the world, just peace, routine, and the company of her books. And in the wake of her loss, the community was left reflecting not only on what had happened, but on everything that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. On August 6th, while cleanup operations were still underway in the aftermath of recent flooding, a local resident was out walking his dog through a section of land that had recently dried. As he moved through the area, he noticed something out of place. As he got closer, his sense of unease grew. Shaken, he immediately called 911 to report the discovery. Emergency services arrived at the scene promptly. The area was secured, and the evidence were carefully recovered and transported to the county forensic laboratory for further examination. At the lab, forensic pathologists began their analysis. Based on the condition, they estimated that the person had likely died over a month earlier. This timeline aligned closely with the disappearance of Adrienne Selenus. To confirm the identity, a DNA test was performed. After several days of processing and analysis, the results came back. It was Adrienne Selenus. Every crime has its own story, and we're here to tell it to you, our dear viewers. Like, comment, and subscribe. Stay with us. Adrienne Celeste Selenus came into the world on a bright and chilly morning, November 5, 1993, in Phoenix, Arizona, a city known for its desert beauty, resilient spirit, and wide skies. As the firstborn of Rick and Pauline Selenus, Adrienne was welcomed with immense love and anticipation. Her arrival marked a joyful chapter in the lives of her young parents, who had recently settled into a cozy home in a modest but friendly neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. 2 years after Adrienne's birth, the Selenus family grew once more with the arrival of her younger brother, Nathaniel. His birth was celebrated with equal excitement, and for a time, the family enjoyed the simple happiness of shared meals, bedtime stories, and afternoon picnics in Encanto Park. Rick and Pauline seemed deeply devoted to their children, building a home filled with warmth, laughter, and music. Pauline especially loved to sing while cooking, and Adrienne often danced along, giggling, while holding her baby brother's tiny hands. However, life took a sudden and devastating turn not long after Nathaniel's birth. Pauline began experiencing mysterious health issues, fatigue that wouldn't go away, persistent pain, and troubling symptoms that no amount of rest seemed to cure. After a series of tests and consultations, she received a diagnosis that turned their world upside down. The illness she faced was aggressive and unforgiving. Despite years of treatments, hospital visits, and moments of fleeting hope, Pauline's health continued to decline. When Pauline passed away, it left an unfillable void in the lives of her family. She was only in her early 30s. Adrienne was 5 years old, a bright-eyed child with ribbons in her hair and a deep love for bedtime fairy tales. Nathaniel, barely 3, had only just begun to form complete sentences. Though too young to fully understand the weight of the loss, the absence of their mother would shape them in ways that would only become clear as they grew older. Rick Selenus, once a cheerful man who loved playing guitar on weekends and watching baseball with friends, was transformed almost overnight. Grief-stricken but determined, he embraced the full responsibility of single parenthood with quiet resolve. He worked long hours at a mid-sized logistics company, often juggling spreadsheets and client calls during the day, while attending parent-teacher meetings and sports practices in the evenings. Despite the exhaustion, Rick made sure Adrienne and Nathaniel never felt alone. He prepared their lunches, helped with homework, told them stories, and listened to their smallest worries as if they were the most important matters in the world. To stay close to his children, Rick became actively involved in their school life. He volunteered as a part-time coach at their school, leading Adrienne's volleyball team and mentoring Nathaniel's youth football squad. He wasn't just a father, he was their role model, their rock, and the person who always showed up, rain or shine. This unwavering love forged an incredibly close bond between Rick and his children. Adrienne, in particular, often turned to him with her thoughts and fears, her dreams and dilemmas. She trusted him implicitly, knowing that no matter what, he would always stand by her side. The trio became a tight-knit unit, leaning on each other, moving forward step by step. Adrienne blossomed into a radiant and spirited young woman. Her personality was a magnetic blend of charm, empathy, and quiet determination. She had a gift for making others feel seen and heard, traits that earned her many friends and admirers. Her athletic build, graceful features, and confident smile made her stand out in any crowd. But it was her kindness and sharp wit that truly made people gravitate toward her. It was around the age of 14 when Adrienne met Francisco Artiga, a boy with a captivating smile and a mischievous twinkle in his eye. A year older and attending the same school, Francisco shared Adrienne's love for music, classic movies, and hiking through the desert trails surrounding Phoenix. Their connection was instant. What began as long conversations during lunch breaks and shared laughter in study halls soon evolved into a deeper, more intimate bond. By the time they reached their senior year, Adrienne believed she had found something truly special in Francisco. He became her first real love, the kind of deep emotional connection that shapes a teenager's worldview. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect teenage relationship lay a complexity that Adrienne often struggled to face. While she was fully invested emotionally, Francisco remained elusive about commitment. He avoided defining their relationship, often stating that he was too young to be tied down, that he wanted to experience life without restrictions. His actions reflected this belief. He casually dated other girls, never hiding it from Adrienne, and though these flings were usually short-lived, they left her wounded. Still, whenever he returned to her, sometimes with a bouquet, sometimes with just a soft apology, she forgave him. She never stopped believing that in time, he would understand the depth of what they shared. Her loyalty never wavered. Adrienne waited, quietly enduring the emotional roller coaster of Francisco's inconsistency. Despite the turbulence in her personal life, Adrienne remained focused on her future. From an early age, she dreamed of becoming a journalist, a voice for truth and change. Her curiosity and articulate nature made her a natural storyteller. After high school, she enrolled in the University of Arizona's prestigious journalism and public relations program, eager to build a career that combined her passion for people and the power of media. Although the university was located in her hometown, Adrienne made the deliberate choice to move out and live independently. She wanted to experience adulthood on her own terms. She found a comfortable, sunlit apartment in a peaceful part of the city and moved in with two of her closest friends, Alexandra Rios and Ashley Dugan. The three young women had been inseparable since their high school years, forming a bond rooted in mutual trust, shared experiences, and unwavering loyalty. They had been there for each other through every heartbreak, every exam season, every late-night phone call that ended in laughter or tears. Moving in together during college had seemed like the natural next step, and their shared apartment quickly became a sanctuary where each of them felt safe, supported, and understood. The living arrangement was ideal. Each woman had her own private bedroom, providing them all with the personal space they needed, while the common areas were filled with warm decor, pictures from high school, and string lights that gave the apartment a cozy, lived-in charm. Their schedules were busy and often unpredictable, but they always made time to eat meals together, talk about their days, and check in on each other's emotional well-being. The apartment wasn't just a place to stay. It was home. Rick Selenus, Adrienne's father, had fully supported his daughter's decision to move out. Though the thought of an empty nest tugged at his heart, he also recognized how important it was for Adrienne to learn independence and create a life of her own. The fact that her new home was just a 20-minute drive from the family house gave him peace of mind. They maintained a close connection, speaking frequently by phone, exchanging text messages daily, and visiting often enough that it never felt like they were far apart. On her 18th birthday, Rick had given Adrienne a thoughtful and practical gift, a reliable used car. It wasn't flashy, but it was hers, and it meant freedom. It allowed her to drive home regularly, whether for Sunday dinners, quick check-ins, or unexpected emotional moments when she simply needed to see her father's face. Their bond had always been deep, forged in the painful years after her mother's passing, and it only grew stronger as she matured. College life brought new challenges and joys for Adrienne. She thrived in her academic environment, quickly gaining the admiration of her professors and the respect of her classmates. Balancing coursework with a vibrant social calendar, Adrienne was one of those students who seemed to do it all, gracefully, energetically, and without missing a beat. Her natural charisma made her a beloved figure on campus, and her determination set her apart. She was well on her way to building a promising future in journalism and public relations. But midway through her second semester, something changed. Adrienne began experiencing an unshakable cough. It started subtly, just a dry irritation she attributed to allergies or perhaps a lingering cold. She downplayed it, relying on over-the-counter remedies. But the cough didn't go away. Within weeks, the symptoms escalated. The coughing became more violent, and she started to feel breathless doing simple tasks like walking upstairs or carrying her backpack. Her roommates noticed her growing fatigue, her paler complexion, and how she struggled to sleep through the night. Still, Adrienne dismissed the concerns of her friends, insisting it was nothing serious. That changed when one evening she collapsed while trying to catch her breath. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Doctors soon delivered a diagnosis that stunned everyone. Adrienne was suffering from a rare but aggressive fungal infection in her lungs. It had gone undetected for too long and had done extensive damage. Emergency surgery was necessary to remove a large portion of her left lung. It was a harrowing procedure, one that came with risks and no guarantees. Despite the gravity of her condition, Adrienne displayed the same resilience that had seen her through so many hardships before. Her body, still youthful and strong, responded well to treatment. Within a month, she was discharged from the hospital and continued her recovery from home. With determination and support from her father and roommates, she made a surprisingly fast return to her academic routine. By the time fall semester began, Adrienne was not only back in class but excelling once again, an inspiration to everyone around her. On June 14, 2013, Adrienne and her roommates decided to host a birthday celebration at their apartment. The event had been planned for weeks, and their social circle was buzzing with excitement. Around 40 guests showed up that evening, filling the apartment with energy, music, laughter, and the usual youthful chaos of college parties. Among the attendees was Francisco Artiga, Adrienne's longtime on-and-off boyfriend. What should have been a night of joy and celebration soon took a different tone. According to several guests, Adrienne seemed withdrawn from the start, her usual sparkle noticeably absent. As the evening wore on, she spent more and more time in her room, alone, away from the music and mingling crowd. The reason? Another argument with Francisco. Witnesses recalled seeing Francisco openly flirting with another girl at the party, barely acknowledging Adrienne's presence. For someone who had always remained faithful to him, who had never so much as entertained the advances of other men, this public slight felt deeply humiliating. Tensions boiled over just before midnight. Francisco repeated what he had told her many times before. He wasn't ready for anything serious. He wanted freedom. Adrienne, hurt and overwhelmed, left the conversation and locked herself in her room. For a while, no one disturbed her. Then Francisco knocked on her door. What was said in private remains unknown, but shortly after, the two were seen leaving the apartment together. What happened next remains the subject of much speculation. Sometime later that night, Adrienne returned to the apartment. This time, alone. She entered her room briefly, gathered a few personal belongings, and then left again. That moment would be the last time anyone reported seeing her. The next day, Alexandra and Ashley slept in, waking up around noon. The aftermath of the party greeted them. Discarded plastic cups, pizza boxes, sticky floors, and a broken chair. The usual chaos. Initially, they assumed Adrienne was simply sleeping off the night behind her closed door and didn't think to check. Even when they realized she wasn't in the apartment later that day, they assumed she had stayed over at Francisco's or perhaps gone to visit her father. There was no reason, yet, to panic. But as the hours passed, unease began to creep in. Texts to Adrienne went unanswered. Her phone rang, but no one picked up. They still didn't call the police, believing she'd show up soon. It wasn't until 2 days later, on June 16th, Father's Day, that her absence took on a chilling new weight. Rick Selenus had been eagerly awaiting Adrienne's arrival that day. Father's Day had always held deep meaning for them. Every year they made it special, cooking dinner together, reminiscing, watching their favorite old movies. But this year, Adrienne neither showed up nor called. More alarmingly, her phone had been turned off. This was completely unlike her. Rick knew immediately that something wasn't right. Without hesitation, he got in his car and drove to his daughter's apartment. He arrived to find Alexandra and Ashley surprised by his presence, and shocked when he asked if Adrienne was home. When they admitted they hadn't seen her since the night of the party, the gravity of the situation became undeniable. After contacting Francisco and learning he also hadn't seen Adrienne since the night of the party, Rick wasted no time. He drove straight to the local police department and officially reported his daughter missing. There was no time to waste. Something felt terribly wrong, and instinct told him she wasn't just staying away for space. The local authorities treated Rick's report seriously, particularly given Adrienne's recent health history, her normally responsible behavior, and the unusual circumstances surrounding her disappearance. A team of detectives was immediately assigned to the case. Within hours, they arrived at Adrienne's apartment, where her roommates, still stunned by the turn of events, walked them through everything they could remember about the party, the guests, and Adrienne's final known movements. The investigators' first objective was clear: reconstruct a minute-by-minute timeline of the night Adrienne was last seen. Nothing could be overlooked. No conversation too small, no guest unimportant. The detectives began by collecting a list of every person who had attended the gathering. Interviews were scheduled. Some guests were contacted by phone. Others were asked to come in person to provide statements. Many admitted they were heavily intoxicated that night, making it difficult to recall specific moments. Still, each detail could hold a key. Simultaneously, forensic experts conducted a detailed search of Adrienne's room. While the scene didn't show obvious signs of a struggle, what they did find raised several red flags. Her wallet, complete with cash, her ID, and her bank cards, was still sitting inside a purse under her desk. More perplexing was the fact that her cell phone, allegedly taken with her when she left, was lying face down on the nightstand. Its battery had died, but detectives knew it could still hold important information, such as recent call logs, text messages, and GPS data. Perhaps the most curious discovery was the single car key resting on the carpet just beside her bed. Adrienne didn't own a spare, and this was her only way to access and start her vehicle. Yet her car wasn't parked anywhere near the apartment. How could she have driven away if her only key had been left behind? The finding contradicted the timeline provided by her friends and raised an unsettling possibility. Someone else might have moved the vehicle. Naturally, suspicion quickly centered on Francisco Artiga. As Adrienne's former boyfriend and the last known person to have seen her, he was brought in for questioning. Calm but visibly nervous, Francisco admitted to arguing with Adrienne that night. According to him, the disagreement had been sparked by her jealousy. He claimed the situation escalated, but that they eventually reconciled and chose to leave the party together in his car. He described what he said happened next. While driving, the argument flared up again. Adrienne, growing emotional and frustrated, demanded that he pull over. Francisco said he stopped near a side street, and Adrienne exited the vehicle, choosing to walk back home alone. He claimed he watched her disappear down the sidewalk and then drove off, thinking she simply needed space. He also told detectives that later that night, he turned off his phone and went to sleep, supposedly unaware that Adrienne had tried to reach him dozens of times. In the early hours of the morning, investigators later confirmed Adrienne had indeed made approximately 50 unanswered calls to Francisco's number. She also sent him a final text message that read, "I'm coming over." That message, in retrospect, might have marked the last time Adrienne communicated with anyone. According to a working theory developed by detectives, Adrienne had possibly walked back to the apartment, picked up her car key, and left again to drive to Francisco's house. Her determination to confront him or resolve things might have clouded her judgment, especially after such an emotionally charged night. But there was another version of events emerging from the forensic timeline, one that only deepened the mystery. If Adrienne had left with her key, returned to change clothes, and then left again, why would she later be found without the key or phone? More importantly, what happened during the gaps in time that no one could yet explain? The breakthrough came when police reviewed incident logs from local traffic reports. Just after 4 a.m. on the same night, a concerned citizen had called in to report witnessing a silver Chevrolet, later identified as Adrienne's car, lose control near a sharp curve, strike a curb, and blow out its front tires. The front bumper was seen tearing away from the vehicle during the impact. The witness, an early morning delivery driver, had initially attempted to approach the scene to offer help. But before he could get close, the car suddenly accelerated and sped away, despite the extensive damage. To the witness, it looked like the driver might have been intoxicated or panicking, possibly fleeing the scene to avoid legal consequences. This new lead prompted an expanded search of the surrounding area. The very next day, Rick and Francisco, who had joined in the effort to locate Adrienne, were canvassing nearby streets when they came upon the vehicle. It was hidden in a narrow alleyway, wedged between two industrial dumpsters, only a few blocks from Adrienne's apartment. Just as the earlier witness had described, the silver Chevrolet was in poor condition. Both front tires were destroyed, the bumper nearly hanging off, and one side of the vehicle bore deep scratches. Crime scene investigators arrived quickly to process the car for evidence. Yet, what they found was both puzzling and unsettling. There were no visible signs inside the vehicle, no broken glass, no DNA. No items appeared to be missing, and the interior was relatively clean. Even more confusing, the doors were locked, and the alarm system had been armed, suggesting someone had exited the vehicle and taken steps to secure it. Fingerprints were limited, mostly Adrienne's and those of her roommates, who had driven with her in the past. No unknown prints were discovered. The pressing question remained: where did Adrienne go without money or a phone? And more pressing, what happened to her after she disappeared from the apartment for the last time? Was someone else involved? Was this a tragic accident or something far more sinister? Despite growing suspicion and scattered theories, no one had definitive answers. As with most missing persons investigations, the people closest to Adrienne were scrutinized first. Francisco, her former boyfriend, remained at the center of the early inquiries. His last known contact with her and his admission to having argued with Adrienne the night she went missing placed him in a critical position. Yet, after agreeing to a polygraph examination and passing, and with no physical evidence linking him to foul play, he was eventually ruled out as a person of interest. Then came a subtle but potentially important lead. Phone records revealed that shortly before she left the apartment for the final time, Adrienne had attempted to book a ride. Her first attempt was with a traditional cab service, but the call went unanswered. Undeterred, she made one final call from her phone, this time to a small, family-owned local transport company that operated late-night rides in East Phoenix. That call would prove to be the last activity recorded from Adrienne's device. The company in question was run by Thomas Simon Sr. and his son, Thomas Simon Jr., who handled many of the late-night pickups. Detectives moved quickly to reach out to both men. Given the urgency of the case, they opted for phone interviews rather than wait for formal meetings. Thomas Sr. answered from the office, cooperative and polite. He confirmed the company had received a call from a young woman matching Adrienne's description during the early morning hours of June 15th. At the same time, Thomas Jr., who was on the road with a passenger, pulled over to speak with investigators. His account was straightforward, at least on the surface. He told detectives that a young woman had indeed contacted him, asking for a ride. Because he was already transporting a client, they agreed on a plan. She would walk to a nearby gas station where he could pick her up shortly after finishing his current drop-off. It was a casual arrangement, nothing out of the ordinary in his line of work. But something did not go according to plan. According to Thomas Jr., when he arrived at the gas station roughly 15 minutes later, the woman was not there. He claimed he waited for several minutes, scanned the area, and even tried to call the number back, but received no answer. With no sign of the passenger, he eventually left the location and continued his shift. Surveillance footage from the gas station appeared to support part of his account. Security cameras recorded Thomas Jr.'s car pulling into the parking lot at around 4:30 a.m. He remained there for approximately 15 minutes before driving away. No one matching Adrienne's appearance was seen on the footage. It was as if she had agreed to the meeting and then disappeared before she could ever arrive. Later that same day, a new and unsettling detail emerged. Authorities received a call from a woman who had been the passenger in Thomas Jr.'s vehicle at the time he took the call from investigators. She didn't initially know about Adrienne's disappearance, but felt compelled to speak after observing what she described as disturbing behavior. According to her statement, after Thomas Jr. ended the phone call with detectives, he appeared visibly anxious, nervous in a way that struck her as unusual for someone simply speaking to law enforcement. She claimed that shortly after hanging up, he pulled the vehicle to the side of the road, got out, and opened the trunk. What she saw next deeply unsettled her. Thomas Jr. retrieved what looked like a saw from the trunk, held it for a moment, and then placed it back before continuing the ride. She didn't know what it meant, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about the moment wasn't right. This testimony escalated the situation. Investigators immediately requested a warrant to search Thomas Jr.'s vehicle and home, hoping to find any items that could either corroborate or dispel the woman's claim. The search was conducted thoroughly, but yielded no physical evidence of wrongdoing. No saw was found in the trunk. No suspicious materials were discovered at his residence. No forensic evidence linked him to Adrienne. Despite his visible frustration and increasingly combative attitude during questioning, Thomas Jr. refused to submit to a polygraph test. Still, legally, refusal to comply with a polygraph isn't grounds for arrest. With no solid evidence connecting him to Adrienne's disappearance, authorities had no choice but to release him and classify him only as a person of interest, not a suspect. At this point, the investigation hit a painful and demoralizing standstill. Leads dried up. Media attention waned. Then, on July 21st, more than a month after Adrienne was last seen, an unexpected and violent storm swept across the eastern parts of Phoenix. In an area better known for its dry climate and scorching sun, the sky darkened and opened up with torrential rain. Thunder roared overhead, and flash floods turned once dusty streets into rushing streams. Local rivers overflowed, sweeping away trash bins, tree branches, and even parked vehicles. It was the worst flooding event the area had seen in over a decade. 2 weeks later, on August 6th, as cleanup efforts continued, a local resident walking his dog through a now-dried section of land came across something unusual. A partial shape, partially buried in mud and debris. Horrified, he realized it was a human and immediately called 911. Emergency services responded quickly and secured the scene. The evidence was transported to the county forensic lab, where pathologists confirmed that the individual had likely died over a month earlier, consistent with the timeline of Adrienne's disappearance. And also, one unmistakable clue helped narrow the possibilities: surgical scars on the chest and the absence of a portion of the left lung. These matched Adrienne's known medical history. DNA testing was conducted, and several days later, it was confirmed. It was Adrienne Selenus. She had been found approximately 30 miles from her last known location. Unfortunately, due to the damage caused by both time and nature, a definitive cause of death could not be determined. Search teams returned to the area with tracking dogs in hopes of finding Adrienne's missing personal belongings, but nothing else was found. With no new leads, no suspects, and no physical evidence pointing investigators toward a clear direction, the case of Adrienne Selenus' mysterious disappearance and tragic death quietly grew cold. Detectives had exhausted every resource available at the time, followed every plausible theory, and retraced every step Adrienne had taken in the hours before she vanished. But to no avail. As months turned into a year, and then into 2, the active investigation gradually slowed. Files were archived, interviews halted, and the case, heartbreaking as it was eventually placed on indefinite hold. Yet fate had one more twist to offer. Nearly 2 years after Adrienne had been discovered, an unexpected tip reignited interest in the case. A man by the name of Kim Aria walked into a Phoenix police station in the spring of 2015, requesting to speak with investigators. What he shared was not definitive evidence, but it was enough to raise eyebrows and compel law enforcement to take another look. He told officers that he had reason to believe one of his longtime acquaintances, a man named Brian Patrick Miller, may have had some kind of involvement in Adrienne's disappearance. Miller was no stranger to attention, though the kind he attracted was anything but ordinary. In his mid-40s at the time, Brian was a regular figure in local subcultures, particularly at cosplay conventions, themed parties, and fantasy gatherings. In his everyday life, however, Miller was markedly different. Described by those who knew him as deeply reserved, socially withdrawn, and intensely private. According to Kim Aria, this contrast had always been unsettling, but it wasn't until 2015 that his unease turned into alarm. That year, Miller's name made headlines when he was arrested and charged in connection with 2 long unsolved crimes from the early 1990s, cases that had haunted Phoenix detectives for decades. In an unexpected turn of events, Brian Miller voluntarily submitted a DNA sample as part of an online ancestry search, a decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The sample, which was entered into a genealogical database, triggered a match, not two distant relatives, but to DNA collected from one of the historic crime scenes. That hit prompted investigators to re-examine Miller's history in detail, and as they connected more dots, charges were eventually filed. Motivated by this chilling thought, Kim began re-examining his personal notes, looking for anything that might connect Miller to Adrienne. To his shock, he found an entry dated the very night Adrienne vanished. According to his journal, Brian Miller had attended a private costume-themed party in a residential neighborhood not far from Adrienne's apartment. In fact, it was only a few blocks away. That alone didn't confirm contact between the two, but it introduced a possibility investigator had never previously considered. Adrienne, walking alone in the early morning hours, could have encountered Miller by chance. Adding yet another layer of suspicion, Aria pointed out that Miller worked at a facility near the very river where Adrienne was eventually discovered weeks after a devastating flood. This detail, while circumstantial, raised troubling possibilities. Authorities took the information seriously. A new team of investigators began re-reviewing the case file. Search warrants were issued, and Miller's residence and vehicle were examined in hopes of uncovering evidence that might link him to Adrienne's case. But despite the renewed effort, the searches came up empty. Without forensic evidence or credible eyewitness testimony to contradict him, law enforcement could go no further. Suspicion alone was not enough to pursue legal action. The similarities between Adrienne's case and the crimes for which Miller had now been charged were difficult to ignore. In April 2023, nearly a decade after his name first surfaced in connection to Adrienne's case, Brian Patrick Miller finally stood trial. Not for Adrienne, but for the murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernas. After weeks of emotional testimony and forensic analysis, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on all counts. Miller was sentenced to 30 years for each crime. But for the family and friends of Adrienne Selenus, the trial brought only partial closure. Her case had never reached court. No charges were filed. No trial was held. And while Miller remained a person of interest in the minds of many, the absence of concrete evidence meant her case could not move forward. When Brian got back home, he instantly sensed that something wasn't right. He called out for Randy, his voice echoing through the house, but there was no response, only silence. As he moved further into the house, his concern deepened. The interior was in chaos. It was as if someone had been frantically looking for something, tearing the place apart in the process. Each empty room only increased his anxiety. There was no sign of Randy anywhere, no note, no clue, nothing to explain what had happened. Finally, he opened the door to the garage, and what he saw stopped him cold. He was met with a horrific sight, one that would be burned into his memory forever. There, in the garage, he found Randy. Overcome with shock and fear, Brian immediately dialed emergency services. Paramedics and first responders arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Randy Trimble entered the world on December 15, 1974, in the quiet heart of Virginia. She was born into modest circumstances, the only child of a resilient single mother who worked tirelessly to provide a life of stability and purpose. From the very beginning, Randy stood out, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried a quiet determination that left an impression on anyone who spent time with her. Her childhood was not marked by extravagance, but it was rich in love, creativity, and discipline. From a young age, Randy showed a deep affinity for the arts. She found her first love in music, taking up the flute and pouring herself into practice with the kind of commitment that belied her age. She didn't just play, she performed with heart. Whether it was school recitals or marching with the band at football games, Randy's presence always carried a gentle strength. In addition to her musical talents, she had a passion for acting and often took part in school theater productions. These experiences helped shape her into someone who was confident, expressive, and deeply empathetic. Randy's academic performance matched her artistic pursuits. She worked hard, driven not just by ambition, but by a genuine desire to build a life where she could help others. After high school, she enrolled at Bloomsburg University in Pennsylvania, choosing to study speech pathology. Her goal was to become a speech therapist, a career that would allow her to work with children and adults who needed support finding their voices, both literally and figuratively. During her years at Bloomsburg, Randy's days were packed. She attended lectures, studied late into the night, and volunteered in local clinics. Her grades reflected her work ethic, and as the financial burden of college began to weigh heavily on her mother, Randy responded by doubling down. Understanding how much was being done to support her dreams, Randy felt a responsibility to succeed. And she did. Her academic achievements earned her a full scholarship to cover her graduate studies, a testament not only to her intelligence, but to her unshakable perseverance. It was during college that Randy met Brian, a fellow student with an easy smile and a kind heart. Their connection was instant. What began as a friendship soon evolved into a romantic relationship marked by deep affection and shared goals. They supported each other through finals, life decisions, and early adult struggles. After graduation, they decided to marry, planning a simple yet meaningful ceremony surrounded by loved ones. But just before the wedding, life dealt them a difficult blow. Brian was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a chronic and unpredictable neurological condition. The diagnosis shook their world. At a time when most couples were planning honeymoons and setting up new homes, Randy and Brian were forced to confront a future clouded by medical uncertainty. For many, this kind of news might have put the relationship under unbearable strain. But not for Randy. She stood by Brian unwaveringly. She reassured him that his diagnosis didn't change her love for him or her vision of their life together. Her loyalty was profound, rooted in compassion and the promises she had made with full awareness of their weight. They eventually settled in Camp Hill, a small town in Pennsylvania that offered the kind of quiet lifestyle they both appreciated. Randy found a rewarding job at a nearby medical center, where she was known for her dedication and professionalism. Colleagues admired her not only for her expertise, but for the way she treated each patient, with dignity, empathy, and patience. Despite earning a stable income, Randy remained cautious about their financial future. She knew the cost of chronic illness, emotionally, physically, and economically. To ensure they would be secure no matter how Brian's condition progressed, she took on a second job. That meant long days and late nights. But Randy never complained. She had a purpose. She and Brian dreamed of starting a family someday, and every extra dollar was a step toward that goal. Brian, for his part, continued to work and do what he could, though his energy was often limited. By early 2003, their lives had settled into a familiar rhythm. But on January 10th, everything changed. That day began just like any other. Randy, then 28 years old, clocked into her shift at the hospital in the morning and worked through the day. She finished around 5 p.m. and went directly to her second job, staying for a few hours before heading home. Brian, meanwhile, had made plans to meet a friend in a nearby town around 8 p.m. He had wrapped up work a bit early and was looking forward to the evening. When Brian returned home that night, however, he sensed something was wrong almost immediately. The house was dark and unusually silent. He called out Randy's name but was met with nothing but stillness. As he stepped further inside, he noticed the home was in disarray. Furniture was out of place. Items had been knocked to the floor, and drawers were left open. It looked like someone had been searching for something, perhaps in a hurry. Panicked, Brian searched room by room. There was no sign of Randy. Then, as he stepped into the garage, he was confronted by a scene that would haunt him forever. There, he found Randy. He called emergency services immediately. First responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Paramedics confirmed her death, and police were called to the scene to begin their investigation. The home was carefully examined. Forensic teams collected every potential piece of evidence: fingerprints, fibers, and any items that might yield DNA. They discovered that some cash and personal belongings were missing, including a gold diamond ring that Randy wore regularly. However, there was no sign of forced entry. One window had been left unlocked, which raised the possibility that someone could have entered unnoticed. Yet detectives were not entirely convinced by this theory. The state of the home, they noted, didn't quite match the typical pattern of a random burglary. There was something different about it, something that felt more deliberate, more emotionally charged. The disorder suggested a personal motive. And so, as is standard in such cases, police began by looking closely at those closest to Randy. It wasn't long before detectives learned that not everything in Randy and Brian's marriage had been picture perfect. Friends and family disclosed that while the couple loved each other deeply, they often struggled with disagreements about the future, particularly concerning Brian's health and financial planning. Randy was meticulous about saving and preparing for potential medical expenses. Brian, however, wanted to live in the moment and resented the constant reminders of his condition. These opposing outlooks led to tension and sometimes heated arguments. This information gave detectives pause. Emotional strain, combined with financial stress, could be a motive. And so, Brian was asked to provide a detailed timeline of his whereabouts that evening. He told investigators he had been in a neighboring town, having dinner with a friend at a local cafe. Surveillance footage confirmed his story, and multiple witnesses, both staff and patrons, corroborated his presence at the location. Additionally, the medical examiner determined that Randy's time of death was approximately 7:30 p.m., a time that placed Brian well away from the crime scene. The distance between the crime scene and where he had spent that evening was substantial. Investigators calculated the drive from the cafe in the neighboring town where Brian had met his friend, a trip that took approximately an hour in each direction. Between verified timestamps, eyewitness accounts, and surveillance footage that clearly placed him at the cafe during the crucial window when the crime occurred, authorities came to a confident conclusion. There simply wasn't enough time for him to have driven home, committed the act, and then returned without leaving any trace or raising suspicion. Logistically, it didn't add up. Adding to this assessment was the physical reality of Brian's medical condition. Although his multiple sclerosis had not yet reached its most severe stages, it had already begun to take a noticeable toll. Family members and close friends revealed that even routine tasks were becoming more physically taxing for him. Walking long distances, carrying heavy items, or even prolonged standing would leave him fatigued. Detectives questioned whether someone already struggling with basic movements could feasibly execute such a violent and chaotic act undetected. The answer, at least for the time being, appeared to be no. In addition, Randy's family stood firmly behind Brian. Her mother, in particular, who had always shared a close bond with him, adamantly told police that she could not envision a world in which Brian would intentionally harm Randy. Those close to the couple described their marriage as strained, yes, but never volatile. They painted a picture of a couple facing enormous pressure but still anchored by mutual care and concern. With Brian seemingly ruled out as a viable suspect, authorities widened the scope of the investigation. They began examining other people in Randy's orbit, friends, co-workers, neighbors, even former acquaintances, hoping to find someone with motive or means. But despite countless interviews and hours of review, there was a glaring obstacle: the complete lack of physical evidence. The forensics team had done everything by the book. They combed the scene for fingerprints, DNA, shoe prints, any trace of a stranger's presence, but came up with virtually nothing usable. Even the missing valuables, like Randy's gold diamond ring, provided little help, as they hadn't turned up in pawn records or black market reports. It was as if the intruder had vanished into thin air, leaving no trail behind. Detectives were left to speculate. Was this really a robbery gone wrong, or had it only been made to look that way? The theory of a personal motive, something deeper and more emotionally driven, began to take firmer root. Weeks passed, and the case stalled. Despite initial progress, the momentum was lost. Frustration grew among the investigative team, and with no new suspects, no new leads, and mounting public pressure, some detectives began circling back to the one person they had cleared early on: Brian. While his alibi was still technically solid, something about Brian's behavior in the aftermath of the tragedy struck many as off. Shortly after Randy's funeral, Brian abruptly relocated. He moved to a different town, one closer to his own family. That decision wasn't especially suspicious on its own. Grief can often compel people to seek comfort and support. But what happened next raised concerns. Brian began withdrawing from the people who had once been a regular part of his and Randy's life. Most notably, he severed all communication with Randy's mother. The same woman he used to call Mom now received silence. For someone who had just lost a spouse and shared years of memories, the coldness of that gesture didn't sit right with those who noticed it. And then there were the purchases. Brian, once frugal and cautious with money, began spending in a way that many considered out of character. He bought a brand new flat-screen television, a gaming console, sleek new furniture, and several high-end electronics. Luxuries that didn't seem to match his previous lifestyle. Friends who visited noticed the changes immediately. When questioned, Brian responded somewhat defensively, saying, "Grieving can get expensive." It was a strange remark, one that stuck with people. When pressed further, Brian explained that he was expecting insurance payouts. One claim for the valuables that had gone missing during the break-in, and another related to Randy's life insurance policy. In the meantime, he said he was simply using the couple's shared savings account to keep himself afloat. Legally, he had the right to do so. But ethically, emotionally, it left people uncomfortable. Detectives, sensing something beneath the surface, decided to dig deeper. They turned their attention to Brian's workplace, an insurance company where he worked in the IT department. There, they began asking quiet questions. Nothing accusatory, just inquiries about Brian's demeanor, his routine, and whether anything had changed in the weeks leading up to the incident. That's when things got interesting. One woman, a colleague who had worked with Brian on multiple projects, agreed to speak with investigators. She explained that Brian had often opened up to her about his personal life, especially about his relationship with Randy. According to her, Brian had complained that he felt restricted in the marriage. He said Randy was constantly monitoring their spending, checking receipts, and asking about every purchase. He felt stifled, like he didn't have control over his own life. Their arguments, she recalled, weren't loud or explosive, but they were persistent and draining. What shocked detectives most was what the woman said next. Just a few weeks before Randy's death, Brian told her he was planning to file for divorce. He sounded serious, determined. But then, as quickly as that revelation had surfaced, Brian changed course. Within a week or two, he began insisting that everything between him and Randy was fine. He even said they were planning to take a short trip together in the spring. The sudden reversal didn't make sense. Before ending the interview, the woman added that Brian had grown unusually close to another co-worker, a man named Blaine, also in the IT department. The two had bonded over a shared passion for video games and horror movies. Blaine, it turned out, had even written a screenplay for a low-budget horror film, something inspired by titles like The Blair Witch Project. Brian had been fascinated by the idea. They talked about it often, even discussing the possibility of producing it themselves someday. But something had shifted in a quiet, almost imperceptible way in the weeks leading up to Randy's tragic death. What once was a lively and often lighthearted friendship between Brian and Blaine had begun to feel different. Their co-workers, people who had spent years working alongside the two men, noticed a distinct change. The usual back and forth, the playful teasing about sports teams, movie plots, and weekend plans, was gone. Instead, where there had once been laughter and openness, there was now a strange stillness. Conversations between Brian and Blaine became noticeably shorter and far more private. They no longer joined in group lunches or casual office banter. Heads would bow closer together when they spoke, voices reduced to whispers. There was a tightness in their posture, an alertness in their eyes, as if each word was chosen carefully and each glance carried unspoken meaning. It wasn't just quiet, it was deliberate. Something was being concealed, and that secrecy wasn't lost on the people around them. This shift didn't go unnoticed by law enforcement either. Detectives, trained to observe subtle human behavior, quietly documented these changes. Although there was nothing concrete, no physical evidence, no confession, they were beginning to believe that Blaine might be holding back. That perhaps he knew far more about Randy's untimely passing than he had admitted during initial interviews. However, the team understood that suspicion alone wasn't enough. They couldn't afford to be premature. If they moved too quickly, they risked tipping their hand. So, they took a different route. Rather than focusing their attention solely on Blaine, investigators chose a more strategic approach. They turned their focus toward Brian, hoping that the pressure might fracture his carefully curated narrative. In the months following Randy's death, law enforcement maintained steady communication with her husband, Brian. On the surface, it appeared routine. Detectives claimed to be revisiting minor procedural details, clearing up old notes, and verifying timelines. But in reality, their strategy was far more calculated. They weren't just checking boxes. They were watching him closely, observing how he reacted under sustained pressure. Brian had grown used to the inquiries. By now, he had answered the same questions multiple times and believed he had settled into a consistent version of events. But the detectives had something else in mind. They wanted to disrupt that comfort, to shake the confidence that had built up around his rehearsed narrative. They invited him to walk them through the night of the incident again, this time in person, right there at the scene of the crime. Brian agreed, though with a clear sense of discomfort. Returning to the home he once shared with Randy was bound to be emotional, and the detectives counted on that vulnerability. As Brian began recounting what he claimed to have experienced on that tragic evening, subtle but important discrepancies began to surface. The account he gave that day didn't fully align with the one he'd shared just weeks after the incident. Originally, Brian stated that when he arrived home and discovered the unsettling scene, he found Randy and immediately called emergency services. He insisted he hadn't touched anything. But now, during the walkthrough, his story changed. He claimed that he had approached her, held her hand. It might have seemed like a minor contradiction to the untrained ear, but to seasoned investigators, inconsistencies like that can carry enormous weight. Stories tend to evolve when someone is hiding the truth, especially when they begin to mix emotion with fabrication. There were other subtle shifts too. Small but telling. The timeline, his movements, the order of events. When viewed individually, these details might not have raised alarms. But taken together, they began to cast serious doubt. From that moment forward, the investigative team shifted their approach. Brian wasn't just someone with an airtight alibi anymore. He was a person of renewed interest. Detectives decided to keep him under a kind of informal surveillance. It wasn't just about collecting new information. It was about keeping him unsettled. They monitored his movements, tracked his phone activity, and made sure Brian knew he was still very much under the microscope. By early May, nearly 5 months after the tragedy, the team was ready to escalate. They brought Brian back in, not under arrest, but for what they framed as a more formal interview. This time, the mood was different. The room was quieter, more serious. There were no casual pleasantries, no soft introductions. They laid out everything they had. The inconsistencies in his statements, his unusual financial behavior after the death, the way he'd cut ties with Randy's grieving family, and the troubling testimonies from his coworkers. The detectives painted a full picture, not of a crime scene, but of a man whose actions didn't align with his words. Then came the turning point. One of the lead investigators leaned across the table and said, very calmly, "We don't believe you were the one who did this, but we do believe you know who did." Silence fell over the room. Brian looked down, seemingly stunned. A long pause followed. His mother, who had come to support him during the interview, looked visibly shaken. After several agonizing moments, Brian asked if she could step out of the room. Once she was gone, Brian turned back to the detectives and with an almost resigned tone, said he was ready to talk as long as one condition was met. He asked them to agree that no one involved would face the death penalty. The officers, realizing they were on the verge of a breakthrough, accepted the condition. What followed was a confession that stunned even the most seasoned members of the team. Brian began by admitting that the relationship between him and Randy had deteriorated much more than he had ever let on. He described feeling micromanaged, suffocated by constant scrutiny over money, decisions, and even daily habits. He said he often felt more like a child being watched than a partner in a marriage. During that time, Brian had found an unexpected escape in his friendship with a coworker named Blaine. Their bond had begun casually shared interests in horror films and video games, but over time, the connection deepened. They would meet frequently to brainstorm creative projects, including a horror movie Blaine had been working on for years. The plot was chilling but fictional. A group of 5 friends hiking through the Appalachian Mountains accidentally awaken a long-buried spirit in a forgotten mining town, triggering a chain of terrifying events. Blaine had written the script himself and dreamed of turning it into a low-budget indie film. Brian, feeling inspired by the project and desperate for purpose, wanted in. As the two began laying out production plans, excitement built. They scouted possible filming locations, began budgeting the project, and even drafted casting calls. But when they added up the costs, actor stipends, basic equipment, lodging, post-production software, it became clear that even a micro-budget film wasn't going to be cheap. Blaine estimated they would need at least $10,000 to make it happen. Brian, knowing he and Randy had been setting aside savings specifically to protect their future due to his illness, offered to fund the production himself. His plan was to dip into their savings account without Randy knowing. He reasoned that once the film was complete and successful, he'd replenish the funds with profit and maybe even improve their financial situation. But Randy found out. She strongly opposed the idea. In her mind, the savings represented security for both of them. It had been painstakingly built over years, meant to cover potential medical needs and the possibility of Brian losing his ability to work. She also expressed concern about Brian's health, worried that the physical and emotional strain of filming off-grid in remote locations could worsen his condition. Faced with her opposition, Brian had no choice but to back out. Blaine was disappointed, even frustrated, but he pressed on without him. Determined to bring his vision to life, Blaine maxed out his personal credit cards and even began using his wife's cards without her knowledge to pay for rentals, permits, and travel expenses. He hired actors, secured a few days of shooting in a rural area of the Appalachian region, and began filming. The production ran for about a week, and on the surface, Blaine was ecstatic. Behind the scenes, however, he was spiraling. The financial pressure had become unbearable. Maxed out credit limits, late fees, and mounting debt created a crushing sense of panic. Blaine's wife, completely unaware of what he had done, began receiving notifications from creditors. When Blaine's wife discovered the truth, that he had secretly amassed more than $18,000 in debt, maxing out multiple credit cards including hers, she was devastated. Their relationship had already been strained by his obsession with the low-budget horror film project. But this financial betrayal pushed things past the breaking point. With their newborn son in tow, she left Blaine, filing for separation and cutting off contact. In the space of a few weeks, Blaine had lost his family, his financial stability, and the trust of everyone who once believed in him. Still, Blaine clung to the belief that the movie would somehow make everything right. In his mind, once the film was completed, it would gain attention from independent film festivals or even streaming platforms. He imagined a breakthrough, redemption through creativity. But there was one major problem. He didn't have enough money left to finish the project. The footage sat unedited, and without the ability to pay for post-production or promotion, the dream was fading fast. That's when Brian stepped back in, this time with an offer and a much darker purpose. Brian still longed to be involved in the film, and more importantly, he was willing to contribute financially. He told Blaine he could access the funds they needed, but there was one immovable obstacle: Randy. Her opposition to using their savings had already stopped the project once, and Brian admitted she would never willingly allow him to touch that money. It was earmarked for medical needs, emergencies, things that actually mattered. At some point in their ongoing conversations, Brian and Blaine crossed a line. What may have started as venting or frustration eventually took a far more sinister turn. They began entertaining a disturbing thought. What if Randy simply wasn't in the picture anymore? Over the course of several weeks, that hypothetical conversation transformed into planning. Together, they developed what they believed would be the perfect scheme. One they pulled directly from the genre they loved most: horror. They drew inspiration from film plots, twisted ideas, and fictional thrillers. Except this time, it wasn't for a script. It was real. The plan, as they envisioned it, had multiple goals. First, they would stage the murder to look like a robbery, creating confusion for police. They also expected that stolen items, including a gold ring and other personal belongings, would justify an insurance payout. More significantly, they believed Randy's life insurance policy, worth $100,000, would unlock the financial freedom Blaine desperately needed and fund their movie. But to pull it off, Brian had to make sure he wouldn't fall under suspicion. And so, the plan hinged on creating an airtight alibi. On the day of the murder, Brian and Blaine both left work early, giving them the time they needed. They returned to Brian's home, where they deliberately ransacked the place, overturning furniture and scattering belongings to make it appear as though a break-in had occurred. Then, at a predetermined time, Brian left the house and drove to a nearby town to meet a friend at a cafe, a move designed specifically to establish his whereabouts and create a verifiable timeline. Meanwhile, Blaine stayed behind in the home. When Randy arrived, likely expecting nothing more than a quiet evening after a long day, Blaine was there, waiting in the shadows. Afterward, he fled the scene swiftly, taking care to dispose of the rubber gloves he had worn, likely to ensure that no trace of his fingerprints or DNA would remain at the scene. The goal was not only to avoid identification, but to reinforce the illusion of a burglary. Roughly an hour later, Brian returned home and called 911, claiming that he had just discovered his wife and had no idea what had happened. During his confession to police, Brian admitted that even he had not expected how disturbing the aftermath would be. When he later met up with Blaine, the details Blaine shared were chilling. According to Brian, Blaine recounted the crime in unsettling detail, showing none of the remorse Brian claimed he felt. Brian even told investigators that the graphic nature of Blaine's description made him physically ill. When detectives asked Brian a question many had been asking for months, "How could you do this to someone who loved you?" his answer was cold and calculated. He said he believed this was the less painful option, explaining that divorce would have caused Randy emotional suffering. In his mind, this was cleaner, final. "It spared her," he said, emotionless. After that admission, Brian was formally arrested and held in jail awaiting trial. But investigators knew their work wasn't done. Brian's confession wasn't enough on its own to convict Blaine. They needed hard, physical evidence to bring charges that would stick. A search warrant was quickly approved, and detectives began combing through Blaine's car. That's where they found a key piece of evidence: a receipt dated the day of the murder, listing several suspicious purchases: rubber gloves, work gloves, a black hoodie, and a pair of black pants. These items lined up almost exactly with what detectives believed had been worn during the attack. The team then visited the store listed on the receipt, hoping to trace any additional purchases made using the same credit card. What they found was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. That same card had also been used to purchase a large fixed-blade knife. With mounting physical evidence, detectives felt confident. But then, unexpectedly, they hit a new obstacle. As they interviewed more of Blaine's acquaintances, they discovered that two of his friends claimed he had an alibi. They told police that they were with Blaine around 7:30 p.m., the approximate time of the murder. If true, this would have thrown a wrench into the entire case. Blaine couldn't have committed the murder and returned home in time if he was still there at 7:30. Police asked the friends for specifics: when they arrived, how long they stayed, and what they did afterward. One mentioned that after leaving Blaine's apartment, they stopped at a nearby gas station and made a purchase. Investigators asked for the receipt to verify the timing, and that's when they found the crack in the alibi. The timestamp on the receipt clearly showed that the gas station stop occurred at 8:30 p.m., not 7:30. That meant the friends had misremembered the timeline. Blaine could easily have been at the scene of the crime earlier and returned to his apartment before anyone showed up. With this revelation, all the pieces finally aligned. The receipt, the clothing, the knife, the false alibi, it was enough. Blaine was arrested and formally charged with Randy Trimble's murder. What happened next shocked even the arresting officers. When detectives arrived at his door and informed him of the charges, Blaine fainted. It was the first and only outward sign of panic he had shown since the investigation began. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Blaine initially denied everything. He insisted he was innocent, that Brian had framed him, and that he had nothing to do with the plan. But as the trial date approached, prosecutors made their intentions clear. They would pursue the death penalty if the case went to court. That pressure changed everything. In exchange for removing the death penalty from consideration, Blaine agreed to a plea deal. He admitted to the killing, telling prosecutors that he believed he would receive $20,000 from Randy's life insurance, enough to pay off his mounting debts and restart his life. In the end, both Brian Trimble and Blaine Norris were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.